everyone, and welcome to a new video. Today's video is going to be a Mockup Mayhem vlog, and this time we are moving into the 70s. So I've officially finished the bonus project, which is going to be a Patreon exclusive and hopefully already posted by the time this goes up. And I've also finished the main Sewing Through the Decades video for the 1960s. So it's time to move on and into probably someone's favorite decade, though not mine, the 1970s. And for this I have a style pattern, and I'm not sure who style patterns were produced by. I can't find a lot of information about them online, but this is a pretty classically 1970s design. When I showed this to my mom, she was pretty sure she followed it when she was younger, or at least had a dress exactly like these. So I think it's a good representation of the era, and I actually think it'll be pretty cute. It is kind of an empire waisted design, which aren't usually the most flattering on me, but it's slim cut too, so I think it could end up looking okay. So I'm going to be following the long sleeve version because I'm using a very lightweight fabric for this, so I think it will still be appropriate for the summer if I do a longer sleeve design. And I don't have very many dresses like that, so I just think it will be a little bit more interesting. So this pattern has 11 pieces in total. It is a size 14 intended for a 36-inch bust, and then a 28-inch waist and 38-inch hips. So I might end up having to add a little bit to this to get it to fit, but it's not too far off, so maybe I can just add a little bit to the side seams and that'll be enough. But we'll see. And this has a zipper down the back of the neck, which I'm very happy to see since I'm not a fan of plackets and side closures, which are incredibly popular pre-1970s. So I'm just going to get my mock-up fabric laid out and get these pattern pieces laid out. It should be intact. If I recall correctly, it was factory folded. It is definitely not factory folded, so I clearly recall incorrectly, but hopefully all of the pieces are here, and I'm going to get them ironed, and we'll just see how this goes. These instructions look so different from any of the previous instructions. I'll show you a close-up in a sec. I'm not sure if that's just because these are from a later period or if this brand was just incredibly different in their approach than others. I did notice that on the pattern pieces, instead of having Spanish and French like they usually did, it appears to be German. I want to say that's German. I know enough about French and Spanish to know that it is definitely not either one of those, and it makes me kind of curious about where this was created. They also have center spelled the non-American way, which I've never seen before. Like, obviously I've seen it before, just not in a pattern. So it says that these were created in London, and they were sold in Canada, South Africa, and printed in Great Britain. Also notice that it's made out of a very different paper than previous patterns. One side feels almost soft to the touch, like really well-worn tissue paper almost. Then the other side feels almost like baking paper. It's very shiny and just feels thicker but more flexible than a lot of patterns. So I think it's going to be less likely to tear, which is nice. And again, I don't know if this is because we are moving into a different decade or if this was just specific to this pattern brand. Since they weren't produced in America, they were produced on different paper that was more available elsewhere. But we'll see. So I need to get these pieces laid out. I need to figure out which pieces I actually need. Because as I said, I'm making the long sleeve version, and sometimes they have different bodices for different variants. But it looks like for this, all the pieces are the same except for the sleeve. So I should count and make sure that I have all the pieces that I need. It looks like they're all there. So I'm just going to start getting these laid out and pinned in place, or weighted in place with pattern weights, depending on how I'm feeling. I painted my nails the same color as they were in the beginning of this video with hopes of fooling you guys, but to be completely honest, it's been about a week, if not longer, since I have visited this project. I got everything cut out on the first day, and I planned on working on that day, but I either wasn't motivated enough or had something else going on. It just didn't happen. And it sat on my sewing table for several days before I decided to put it away, and then I just didn't get around to it until tonight. But I'm determined to get this done for some reasons that I will talk about in just a moment. But first I want to get started. So step number 1 is marking the darts in the back panel, and then sewing the darts in the back panels, and then stitching the panels together and sewing in a zipper. I'm probably not going to bother with a zipper for this particular project, but I can get those darts sewn. It also wants me to stay stitch most of the pieces, but I don't think I'm going to bother doing that this time around. Stay stitching just helps prevent the fabric from stretching at those points, so it doesn't end up warping when you're trying to set a collar or a cuff or something like that. So this is the skirt back, so that should be set aside. This is the bodice front, which I can actually focus on as well, even though it doesn't come up until later on in these steps. It wants me to stay stitch this edge and then make pleats on outside by folding along solid lines and bringing folds to broken lines, which are right here. It also wants me to stitch the center fronts of the skirt together, so I can do that as well. So this is the skirt front, so I'm just going to go ahead and pin those pieces together and then get that over my sewing machine. And I also need to double check what the seam allowance is. So I'm just going to go ahead and roughly mark the pleats on this pattern piece. So the reason that I want to finally get this video filmed is because this is one of the few formats that I filmed that requires me to talk kind of consistently and in real time as I film. And that means that I have to be in relatively high spirits. And I have a feeling I'm not going to be in particularly good spirits in the coming days because I have to get vaccinated. I haven't had any vaccinations or immunizations since I was 3 months old, so I'm really behind. And there were medical related reasons for it, which is why I didn't get them when I was really young, but I have no good excuse for not getting them once I was older. It's just been something that I put off because I'm the type of person that gets sick when I get a flu shot. So obviously getting a cold after getting a flu shot is better than getting the actual flu, and getting a cold after getting a measles shot or a polio vaccine is a lot better than getting those actual diseases. But I'm a lazy person and I have put off the minor inconvenience because I work from home and I didn't go to college and I'm not around babies or small children, so there hasn't been anything that forces me to get them done. But with measles outbreaks and stuff in the news, and obviously people out there who are compromised and can't get the vaccines, I really need to get them. So that is what I'm doing tomorrow, and I'm not excited about it because they did not sound very happy on the phone when I made the appointment, but I'm just going to get it over with. However, I have a feeling I might not be feeling super well after, and I might potentially get a cold after. So I want to prep a whole bunch of videos that I can edit and get things like voiceovers and chatty videos out of the way before I get that done, because I might not be able to film them for a little while after. But I do just want to make it very clear that I support vaccines. I know they don't cause autism. That's not why I haven't gotten them. It's been medical reasons and then pure laziness on my part, which is not a good excuse at all, but that's the truth about that. I have actually had a tetanus shot though, which is good because I prick myself with needles on a very regular basis. But the reason I actually had to get it was because I smashed my toe into a metal pipe and it did bad things for my toe. And I'll just leave that at that. So you just saw me pin the pleats into the front panel, and now I'm going to mark the darts and then get those pinned and sewn. Even though I haven't really been working on this project, I've actually had a pretty awesome productive week. There have definitely been days where I've not gotten as much done as I would like, but I'm finally moving forward with a whole bunch of projects that have been on my want to make list for a really long time. So it just feels really good to finally be progressing with those projects. However, fittings with all of them today, and so far everything is looking good, but 2 of them don't have sleeves yet, and sleeves tend to be the part that I struggle with the most and end up being the least happy with. So I might not exactly be singing those projects' praises later tonight. In fact, I will probably be swearing about those projects later tonight. But for right now, I'm pretty pleased with how they are coming along. On top of drafting the sleeves for those projects, I also want to get a whole bunch of ruffles for an 1820s project hemmed or prepped for hemming. They're all going to be hemmed by hand, which is going to be tedious because each ruffle is about 6 yards long, so that'll be fun. But I want to get the bottom edge of those strips turned inward twice to form the beginnings of a rolled hem, so that'll be much easier to hand sew. While I'm stationed over here, I'm also just going to go ahead and pin the facing pieces together. So this is the facing for the front of the bodice, and then this is the facing for the back portion of the bodice. And it's left open at the back because this zips closed with a zipper. So it just gets stitched like that. On top of filming this video as a chatty video, I also filmed a clothing haul. So I still have to film a whole bunch of footage for that, where I try on all of the garments and style them. But even if I get sick, I can still film those portions because you won't actually see my face for those, or at least I don't think you will. It'll be more about what the clothing looks like. So I think because this sleeve pattern is kind of complicated, there are a whole bunch of pleats at the cuffs, like maybe a dozen pleats, as well as quite a few pleats at the shoulders. I'm just going to make one sleeve. And in fact, I only cut out one sleeve, so that was clearly my plan when I was working on this a week ago, too. Also, speaking of these pleats, when I was originally looking through the pattern instructions, I thought these were tucks. So they were marked on the fabric and sewn almost like darts to displace the volume to above the cuff. And I was so not looking forward to that because I'm going to be using a rayon fabric for this. And even though I'm planning on starching it before I get started, I knew that would be absolutely miserable to do with such a flimsy fabric. Now this still isn't going to be super fun. Pleats are a little bit easier than tucks, and you don't have to be quite as precise with them. So I'm really happy to see that, because yeah, I was really not looking forward to trying to do this with tucks. So I might as well get this pinned and sewn. I like to do as many of these steps as I possibly can in one place before I move to another place, because it just makes editing a little bit easier, and hopefully as long as I explain things, it's still easy enough to follow. And on the real thing, there's a slash that's bound with a facing right here, but for the sake of this project, I'm just snipping the facing and trimming 3/4 of an inch around it, and that should give us a pretty good idea of how it will look on the finished garment, just with significantly less effort. All of the pleats are going in this direction. I'm also going to quickly pin the cuff. I must say I find this pattern quite difficult to follow with how many different languages are printed on it. The instructions are only in a single language, so I don't know if this is an English version of the instructions, but it was sold with different instructions in different countries, or what the deal is. Diagram in the instructions, it looks like I'm just folding this in half and then sewing this end like this, and clipping the point and turning it right side out. And then I'm sewing this end just straight across, which is pretty standard for cuffs. Actually, their specific instruction for that is fold cuff along fold line with right sides together, stitch ends to seam line, continuing to small dot to form lap, clip to small dot, trim corners, trim seam, turn cuff, and press. So that is what I'm doing. Now I'm going to take all of this over to the sewing machine and get all of this stitched up. So I realize this isn't exactly the best vantage point for you. I'm just pinning the front sections onto the top of the skirt portions. Then I'm going to repeat this with the back. So it's pretty straightforward. And I don't know if you'll be able to tell, but the tops of the skirt pieces actually had a pretty harsh curve. And I wasn't sure how well that would work with the shaping at the bottom edge of the bodice pieces. That is a mouthful. But since there are the pleats there, it actually kind of shapes to that curve really nicely. I think they knew what they were doing. It's almost like they're professional pattern makers or something. So that is what the front pieces look like pinned on. As I said, they pivot really nicely to follow the curve at the tops of these pieces, and that'll be sewn with 5/8 of an inch allowance. Then I'm just going to do the same thing on the back panels, and I'm probably going to go ahead and sew up the bottom portion of the back seam while I'm at it, just because that's what they tell you to do after doing that step. It's a very convenient time to do so. And that is actually step number 2. It wants you to completely assemble the back panels before you get started on the front panels. And I actually really like how they have you inserting the zipper early on. Sometimes they have you do that as a last step after the rest of the garment is constructed, but it's much easier to do when the pieces are still laid flat. So I really like that, and I think that means this will go together in a very nice manner when I make the actual final garment. So here it just has stay stitching for the front pieces, the pleating, which we did, sewing the center seam, which we did, or rather I did, and then this is the step we are currently on. After that, you sew up the shoulder seam, and then you sew on the collar. And then we get to faff around with facings and other such fun things. But so far this is going pretty well. I just hope it ends up fitting, because I didn't add any additional allowance to this, and it is a little bit smaller than my measurements. So I'm hoping that there's a little bit ease in the measurements they provided. So someone, not mentioning any names, foolishly forgot to turn their iron back on after they refilled the water. So I can't use it for a couple minutes, which means I can't iron all of the pieces that I just sewed. So I'm going to work on the collar, and eventually this will have a bag-lined collar, so I'm going to assemble it twice, and then sew the piece together with the right sides facing each other and turn it right side out so all of the raw edges are tucked away. But for this one, I just want to get the scale of the collar and the effect of that without actually sewing several layers together and taking up that seam allowance. So I'm just going to go around the outer edge and trim 5/8 of an inch away. It's going to imitate how the collar will look when it is properly sewn without the effort of actually properly sewing it. And then I'm just going to go ahead and seam the pieces together with a 5/8 of an inch allowance at this back edge. Actually, I don't know if it even tells me to do that because it closes with the zipper. So let me double check the instructions. I'm glad I checked. These are meant to be finished independently, and eventually this seam allowance would actually get tucked away when lined as well, so I can trim that off too. So that is going to be our stand-in collar for this mock-up, and now I should be able to iron all of these without my iron getting mad at me. The iron has to be hot enough to turn the water into steam, otherwise it spits and does bad stuff for the iron. So that's why I had to wait. So I went ahead and sewed up the portion of the back seam, I sewed up the shoulder seam, and then I went ahead and basted on the collar, or our stand-in unfinished sections, which are functioning as a collar. And this pattern continues to impress me, at least in terms of instructions. I'm not sure how the fit will be just yet, but they want you to add the facing and attach the collar before you do up the side seams, which is my preferred way of doing it. So I'm going to pin the facing on with the point at the center and the right sides facing each other. And on the final garment, the raw edges of the facing will be tucked in prior to doing this, so it's nicely finished, but I'm not going to be bothered with that for a mock-up. Then this will get ironed inward, and I have to do up the side seams, and then it is just fiddling around with these sleeves, which is the part I'm least looking forward to because I always seem to sew on the cuffs incorrectly. And I have a feeling that the sleeves are going to be far too short for me, since that seems to be a pattern with literally all of these patterns. It's also why I don't buy vintage long sleeve shirts or blouses, because they're always too short for me too. So that's ready to be sewn, but while I'm over here, I also want to get the cuff sorted out, preferably before my camera battery dies, which gives us about 4 minutes. So the exact instructions are, with right sides together, pin sleeve to cuff, placing underarm seam and medium dot. Baste, stitch, trim seam, press seam towards cuff. Turn under 5/8 of an inch on raw edge of cuff, slip stitch in place. So right sides together. I don't remember which side had the medium perforation, but I get what they want me to do. So it's basically stitching it on like this. And you want to make sure that you don't catch this edge since that'll be tucked inward, and finish the interior. And I gather the medium dot that I was puzzled about earlier lines up with that seam, which is what they were just talking about. So it all makes sense now. And there's a notch right there that lines up as well. So these are actually pretty easy to get matched up. I think on the last 2 patterns, they just did not have very clear instructions for that. However, this cuff appears to be a little bit too large for the sleeve, which is not ideal. So I probably pleated it a little bit too tightly. Oops. Also, I apologize if the lighting looks really crummy here. I try not to film videos at night because I noticed that the camera is really overcompensating for how dark it is in here, and the footage ends up being quite grainy. And if I turn my camera settings down, then the footage is just very, very dark and unpleasant to look at. And the reason for that is that none of our rooms in this house have overhead lights, and this table is in the middle of the room. So I just have lamps kind of scattered about, but it doesn't quite make it to this table. So I actually just purchased overhead lights. They're swag lights though, so they can plug into an outlet, and then I can have the cords running off the walls and have it hang from the ceiling. So I'm really, really excited about that. I'm also excited because I'm going to hang dragons from it, and that's going to be awesome. But I'm really looking forward to having better lighting so I can film in here at night. And if it works out, then I'll put one over my sewing machine too, because since I always have fabric kind of running across that surface, I don't want to have a lamp on top of it or right next to it. It'll just get knocked over, which means it's very dark over there too, and those are the places that I'm working at most often. So it's really annoying to have it be dark half the day. So that is a long ramble, and hopefully while doing this I've also been sewing and showing that process, because that's more interesting than just listening to me talk while looking at a unsewn cuff. Okay, so I just sewed the facing in. There are a few more pins holding it in place than I had intended because my bobbin ran out of thread while I was sewing in the ends without me noticing. So instead of restitching that, I just pinned it, which isn't great, but it's perfectly fine for a mock-up. Then I quickly did up the side seams, and they matched up quite nicely even though I didn't pin them. And now it is time to set the sleeve. And I'm not particularly looking forward to this, though they do have relatively simple instructions for it. Sometimes they have you basting these sleeves and matching like 4 dozen different points, and they have a whole technique to this, whereas this just says, with right sides together, pin sleeve to armhole edge with center small dot at shoulder seam. Match remaining small dots, match seams at underarm, pull up machine stitching to fit. Baste, easing fullness, stitch, stitch 1/8 of an inch away from first stitching, trim seam close to stitching, press seam towards sleeve, shrinking out fullness. Okay, I guess they do have a lot of instructions. I was hoping they wouldn't have me ease this and gather it and do the whole basting thing, because there are the pleats in the sleeve cap. So I was hoping that those would get it down to the perfect size without me having to make too many adjustments, but I guess that isn't the case. So I'm going to go ahead and get the various points lined up and get this pinned and sewn, and then I can try this on, and I really hope it fits, because so far I'm really impressed by their instructions. I'm really impressed by how things matched up. The only thing that hasn't really gone to plan is the collar. It ended up being a little bit farther off from the center than I thought it should be. As you can see there, it is supposed to extend to the very center front, and the collar actually wasn't even long enough to make it to the end of the piece. So I feel like the collar might be drafted a little bit on the small side, perhaps by 1 inch, but that piece is small enough and that flaw is obvious enough that I can always recut it and redo it on the real thing if the pattern itself doesn't end up working out. But right now I'm willing to count that as an error on my part. I probably just didn't match it up properly, and I also just trimmed this edge instead of sewing it, so that could have affected it too. But this is where it's currently at, so I'm just going to do these sleeves quickly off camera, and then I shall try it on. This side matches up perfectly, but this side is way off. Like, there's probably a good ½ inch, if not 3/4 of an inch of ease that needs to be taken in there. So when I'm making this for real, I'm definitely going to have to gather that top edge down slightly. But I think for the sake of making this mock-up quickly and having it look somewhat clean, I'm just going to add an additional pleat there to imitate the amount of volume it would have on the final garment. And then I will get it sewn on and tried on. So I clearly made the wrong sleeve because now I have to hold the camera with my left hand, which is incapable of staying steady or focused at all. But this is the finished mock-up, and to my surprise, it fits over my hips really nicely. It also fits me in the bust a lot better than I thought it was going to, though it is a little bit high in the bust. However, I feel like if I pull it down, it looks okay, and I also feel like when it's made out of the lighter fabric, it's naturally going to drape and probably sit a little bit lower. And also, to my surprise, I think the cut of this is pretty flattering. It doesn't fit me perfectly through the waist. I think I'd probably end up taking it in just a little bit at the sides to get more of a shape to it, and I think that's a lot more flattering. But I was really concerned with this being an empire waist dress, that it was going to look kind of like a maternity dress and just have way too much excess volume in the stomach and not enough volume in the hips, and just end up being really unflattering, kind of like the first 1960s mock-up project. I just felt awful in that mock-up in that dress, and I thought this was going to be a repeat of that, but I think it's really cute. Like, if this turns out well, I could see making another one of these out of a fun cotton. It doesn't take very much fabric. It's really easy to put together. It would be very easy to alter this to be a pattern made with French seams, since none of the seams really connect. And yeah, I'm just really pleased with it. The only change I think I need to make is, as I said, potentially taking it in a little bit at the sides. I'm also probably going to add about 1 inch onto the hem, just because the rayon I'm using is going to warp quite badly, and I want to make sure that I have enough to trim it to be level. And I think they want you to do 2 inch hem with this length, so it's going to feel so short after making all the projects from the 30s and 40s and 50s where they all went past the knee. But this already feels quite short, and it's going to end up being at least 2 inches shorter than this. Another issue with lengths that I have is with the sleeves. They look fine when my arm is resting, but whenever I do anything with my arm, there's some serious wrist on display. So I think I'm going to end up adding probably 1 inch or maybe even 1.5 inches at some point in the sleeve to cause it to sit further down. But where it sits on my shoulder and everything is really nice. I didn't end up adding a zipper in the back, so it's just kind of roughly pinned, but it fits pretty nicely back there as well. So on that alarmingly positive note, I'm going to end this video. I'm seriously so shocked. Also, don't mind my full body Spanx just hanging out here. I had those on underneath it, by the way. But yeah, I'm so shocked by how that turned out. I had such high expectations for the 1960s pattern, and though I ended up liking what I made out of it, the mock-up for that was such a disappointment. I felt so awful in that mock-up. I just thought it looked horrible on me, and it was really hard to stay motivated, and it was really discouraging, and that kind of carried through the entire process of making that project. And this dress, though I thought it was cute on the pattern envelope, I didn't think it would translate well to reality. I thought it would end up making me look kind of pregnant just because of the empire lines, but this was cut really nicely, and I hope it translates well when I'm using a flowier fabric for it. Because I think the fabric I have for it is perfect and it's so 70s. But if it doesn't, then I'm going to continue forward and make this out of a cotton or something, because I do think it's a really cute dress and I think it looked really nice. I'm seriously so shocked. I was expecting to have a dress that I wore for some photos and then probably got rid of because it didn't suit me, but I think I'm going to get a really nice summer dress out of this, and if it goes well, I might even make it again, because it seriously went together really nicely. It was very easy to make, it didn't take a lot of fabric, and if it looks that good, I don't know, I could be tempted. So I'm feeling exceedingly positive going off of this and almost excited to work on this, even though I have to make it out of rayon. So that's awesome. I think this is the best a mock-up vlog has ever gone, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you so much for the support, and I will be back at you with another one of these videos very soon, and this time we are venturing into the 80s. That is another decade that I'm not expecting to flatter me. Though there were a lot of high-waisted pants in the 80s, and I am fond of high-waisted pants, so we could get something good out of this, but we shall have to wait and see together. So thanks again for watching, and I'll talk to all of you very soon.